So hello everyone, welcome to Frequently Asked Questions About Beekeeping, episode 37. Today is Friday, November 1st, and this is The Way to Bee. So if you're new, welcome. This is about backyard beekeeping, small scale, people that are just learning, just getting started. If you want to know if I can answer your question, please feel free to write it down in the comment section. If you want to see what's going to be covered in today's video, look down in the video description and you will see line item by line item the things that we're going to talk about so you can find out if it's something that you're interested in. The other thing is, some people keep asking, how do you get the whole playlist? Well, you go all the way to the very end of this video and you look at the last few seconds and there'll be little icons that show up there, and each one of those represents a playlist so you can see them all. Needless to say, this is FAQ 37, but I think there's like 50 videos in the playlist because things that I've done single topics on will also be in there, so you'll be able to look at those. These are questions that I'm answering that were posted between last Friday and today. So what's going on right now? Well, let me tell you something about in my area. When you saw the opening sequences here, it was raining and I was trapping down all the beehives. Why? Because we had a huge storm come through and sustained winds and gusty winds, 45 to 50 miles an hour, and heavy rains. And it dropped to the 30s overnight. So we got them all strapped down just in time. If you want to see a video on how I strap and tie down my beehives, there is one, so I'll put that in the video description. And if you want to learn more about the hive stands I use, they're better this year because I can strap them down and they're anchored well into the ground. So be prepared for the heavy stuff to come through. Winter is going to hit, and I hope it did not catch you off guard wherever you live. Now, if you're in the southern hemisphere, good for you. It's getting warmer. You're coming out of winter. Your life is always great. Your weather's always warm. You don't have a frozen winter. That's just fantastic. We're heading into Christmas, and it's going to be cold. And it's No Shave November. I stopped shaving today. So let's move on. Here's the very first question posted by a viewer. His name is Thin Less. If you're feeding bees going into winter, and we are, can you just feed them dry sugar? Okay, this is something that actually comes up a lot. People pour dry sugar inside their beehives. There's a method to it. Can you feed them dry sugar? Sure. What should you not be feeding this time of year? First week of November, you should not be feeding sugar syrup. So even if you're doing 2-to-1 and you're getting freezing nights, get that out of there. They can't dehydrate the sugar. They can't dehydrate the syrup. They can't store it. They can't use it. And it can give them dysentery. So you don't want to give your bees diarrhea. Remember, they're going to cluster and they're going to be stuck inside the hive. So dry sugar. A lot of people feed them dry sugar. I've tried it in the past. Of course, the best food for your bees through winter is what? Honey, stored honey. So you at least want a medium super of honey over your deep brood box to get them through winter. Why would people put sugar in there? Well, it's an insurance policy. So there are a lot of ways to do it. I have seen people, this is a miniature hive body with little miniature frames just for lecturing about bees. So this is not the real size, but I'm going to use this as a sample. I have seen people take, and when we're talking about feeding sugar, by the way, processed granulated sugar, whether it comes from cane or whether it comes from beets, really doesn't matter. It's a sugar, sucrose, energy source for the bees. It's just to help them generate warmth, to have energy, to survive winter. And I've seen some people just take it and pour it right on the backs of the individual frames. To me, that's not a great way to do it. You're going to miss a bunch. It's going to fall down inside there. The very first chance the bees get to fly out, you get one of those warm days, they're going to remove that as debris that they don't want in their colony, so they're going to carry the little granules of sugar right on out of there. So how would you put it right on top of your frames? Well, people use newsprint. This is newsprint. Notice it's missing the print. This is the print paper that newspapers are printed on, and I get it in big sheets. I get it in boxes. When you get this stuff, you can custom make a single layer sheet of this and fill your top box. cover right over the top of the frames. Then you can curl up the edges for a smaller scale. You can curl up the edges like this, and that means when you pour your sugar on there, it's going to stay right here. It's not going to, if it's breezy when you're doing it, it's not going to blow off. You'll set this on top of your brood box, or if you've got a honey super on, a medium super, you can put it right on top of there. And then all you do is take your white sugar and pour it right on there. And of course, remember, this is a miniature scale, but this is what you're doing. You're just putting it on there. Now, do you have to poke little holes in the paper so the bees can get up there? No, you don't. What are the bees going to do? Well, for one, the bees don't like paper in their hive. That's why it's pretty important what kind of paper you're putting in there. If you're going to get this from the newspaper, don't get it from the advertising section with all the slick newsprint on it and all the slick pictures. There's more pigment in there. The bees are going to chew it and pull it apart, and they're going to haul all the little pieces of paper out of the hive completely. Now, what happens to the granulated sugar that you set up here? Well, through the wintertime, there's going to be some condensation going on. So some people think that putting dry sugar in the top of your colony like this works as a desiccant. It absorbs moisture. And when it does that, what happens is your free-flowing granules of sugar here will turn into an actual solid mass of sugar. Then the bees can't fly it out. So what you'll see is little dished out areas where the bees have been eating it. In order for those workers to eat dried sugar, they have to have moisture. This is where condensation inside your beehive comes into play. I'm one of those people that thinks that a little condensation inside that beehive is not only okay, but it's critical for the bees to survive winter. Where do you think they're going to get their water in the wintertime when they can't leave the hive and they're all clustered up in there? They're looking for water in the form of condensation inside the hive, and they're going to lick that off. There are water bees. That's a job. They transfer water from one bee to another, and those bees that are generating heat to preserve and protect the brood will be fed water from the water bees. So we need some condensation inside. Look at where this is located. This would be in the center, directly over the cluster. In general, the bees cluster in the middle. And when they do that, they insulate themselves with bee bodies. So when you look at a cluster of bees and they're all balled up together between the frames, it's very cold on the outside edges of that cluster, and the middle is very warm. And wherever there's brood, they're clustered over it, and they're going to keep that warm enough so the brood doesn't die. Now, the vacant spaces beyond the cluster tend to become the same temperature as the outside temperature of the hive. So how do we know that? Well, we look at them with imaging cameras that show us the thermal print of the box itself, and you'll see that the interior corners and areas well beyond the cluster are just as cold as the outside air. So the bees will rise up through the bottom of this paper, and they'll start to chew little holes in it. Bees have mandibles. The workers can chew holes in it. And remember, they're going to pull those bits and pieces of paper out. And when they get warm days and they can do flights, they're going to be hauling the paper out right along with the dead bees that they're getting rid of. And eventually, all this paper will be gone, and the sugar with it. Now, if they don't need the sugar, if they've got plenty of honey, and if when those warm-up days come, they're flying out and they're foraging and they're getting other resources, they're going to ignore your sugar. So in the spring, you may end up with just a clump of solidified sugar because condensation has gotten to it and it's firmed up. And then you might say, wow, you know, the bees aren't even touching that. Did that sugar spoil? Well, processed sugar doesn't spoil. So even when it becomes a little damp and becomes like a little sugar brick, it is not going to spoil. We know that the reason that sweetened liquids spoil is because of the water content in them. So when you have more than 20% water in your sugar composition, you know that you have the potential for that to spoil. This is not a method that I like to use. So is there an alternative method? Yes, there is. So if you took this off and you decided not to use the sugar method, we can go back to putting an inner cover. The inner cover on the top of your hive, right on top of that honey super. And then you would put this over the feeder hole on that inner cover. And then you would take as you know, I've brought these up a lot. These are the Rapid Round feeders. It sits over that hole. Now remember, this is an inner cover, so all of this is covered. Because one of the things I don't like about putting the newsprint on and pouring sugar on top of the newsprint is, what did we have to do to put that on? We had to pull the outer cover off. We had to pull the inner cover off. We had to expose the inner portions of your hive to the cold air. Plus, when we took off that inner cover, what did we do? We took off the inner cover and we broke the seal between the top of the box and that inner cover, which is propolised by the bees. And once winter hits and it's really cold, they don't do propolis work anymore. So they can't seal things back up very well. So any damage you do to the inner structure of that beehive during winter, the bees are not going to be very good at repairing it. So if you left little vent opens around those edges, that's a place for the wind to blow in and to challenge the bees when they're trying to protect themselves in cluster. So we can bypass that problem by going to your feeder shim or your inner cover. This goes on top of the inner cover. This goes on top of that. And now when we pull this off, normally, if you're feeding a liquid, we would have this inner protection shield on here. We can look through it. We can see what the bees are doing. They'll be coming up through the center riser and they'll go over this and they'll go down and they'll get the liquid feed. But remember, liquid feed's gone. So one of the reasons that you keep this cover on is because when it's off, if this were full of liquid, your bees are going to come up over the top, and this has really nice ridges in it so the bees can get their footing. They can come out, they fall in the liquid, they spread out all over, and they drown in here. But that's not what we're doing now. Now we're dry feeding. So when you have this set up, what did we do when we opened the outer cover? We're looking straight at this now. Have we exposed the bees to the freezing air? No, because there's another cover on it, just like that. And then what happens is when we pull it off, first of all, don't open it until you're ready to take care of them. Don't open it just to see if they have food. If you do that, be prepared to replenish their food supply, so you're doing this all in one move. You don't want to have to open it, close it, come back, check it, and then lose track of even which hives need what. So then you just take your sugar and you're going to pour it around this whole outside area. So now this becomes your dry sugar feeder, and the bees come through over the top of this and they walk all over it. And they get the sugar content that they need, the energy resource that they need. And remember, this is an emergency feed. So all you're going to put in here is dried sugar, and then we're going to put this cover on. And because this outer cover is on, you don't need an inner cover for your feeder shim or your shallow super or whatever you use to house this. And then you just put your cover on top of that. So now we have an airspace in here that is not accessible to the bees. Now that airspace obviously gets as cold as the outside air. And then what happens is the surface of this gets cold and the inner surface gets heat rising through that center column and touching right in the middle, so you're going to get some condensation here. So what we've done is the heat rising from the bees into this space condensates on these inner surfaces and gives the bees a place to lick moisture off, which then will help them to metabolize the sugar and they get the energy that they need. And then when spring comes along and you've got some sugar remnants here, you can remove this and replace it with a clean one, or you can add sugar syrup to it, because remember, this hasn't spoiled, and then you can liquefy this, turn it back into sugar. But when you turn this into a sugar syrup, don't forget to put this cover back on. In fact, when you take this off, leave it in the hive right next to it. That way you don't have to run around looking for it. So then this goes on when you go to liquids, and again, you're back in business for spring feeding if you need to do that. So if you're going to give them dry sugar, my personal preference is not to use the newsprint, but instead put one of these on the inner cover, and that way you allow yourself access without disrupting the infrastructure of the hive, which are all the tissues that are holding those pieces together and sealing all those joints up. And you're not exposing them to cold blowing wind. And hopefully you're going to do that on one of the better days anyway. So if temperatures get into the 50s and you see the bees doing cleansing flights, that's a good time to pop the cover and look in on your bees and replenish your sugar. Be prepared to do it all in one visit. So yes, you can feed dry sugar. Dry sugar is just an energy source. It is really not nutrition for the bees, but it can sustain them, and it is a survival move. So hopefully they haven't run out of natural honey that they stored through the year, but that can happen. Can you feed dry sugar in the summertime? You could, but there's no point to it. You're much better off giving them a syrup by the time summer hits. So if you're in a dearth, dry sugar, it's really not a good move. You're also not going to have the condensation that you have during winter. You won't have that through the summers. That means water bees have to go out, get water, bring it in, then go to the sugar, then try to liquefy it. And as many have noticed who have done this before, once spring hits, whatever sugar is left over gets almost completely ignored by the bees. So you're probably going to be cleaning it out anyway, but it is safe to convert that now back to a sugar syrup. So you can dissolve it, mix it up, feed it back to them. So that's not lost. So yes, but to just, the way this is worded, can you just feed them dry sugar? Hopefully that's in addition to the honey that they've also collected through the year, so it's not the only thing you're feeding. Number 2 is from Fred S. When should you put on the mouse guard? I don't want to put it on too early so they can't get out and get rid of drones. Well, because of the freeze now and everything that's going on, the drones are being cast out in huge numbers. So now here's the thing I've been doing where I live. How do you know how many mice are trying to get into your beehives? I put out cameras throughout my apiary, and believe it or not, they even pick up mouse movement. So the number of mice that I have running around, and I had one that climbed up the front of a beehive, sat on the landing board, scamped off of that, went over to the next beehive, sat on the landing board, ran around the back, down the leg that supports the hive, and off into the meadow. Never even attempted to get in through a normal entrance reducer. This is a pretty restricted entrance reducer. In fact, this is almost too small. This is the size entrance reducer I would put on if I had a late season swarm and they don't have a lot of numbers to protect their entrance. I like to make this entrance at least 1.5 inches long to 2 inches. And I like that to be open at least 3/8 inches in height. So 1.5 inches to 2 inches in length and 3/8 inch height for that. Now, can a mouse get through there? A full-size deer mouse, which is what we predominantly have where I live, can squeeze through there, but he has to do it on a really cold night and when the guard bees aren't there guarding. And don't get me wrong, mouse gets in there, it's a big deal. They chew all your stuff, they defecate in there, they carry viruses themselves. Mice will eat some bees, not to the point where it would damage the colony, but you do want to keep them out. So I would say if you can put out cameras to see what the mouse activity is, which I'm doing, and then once that activity ramps up and you see them, because mice don't just go in the colony and stay there, they come and go. They run out and they get resources, they run in. The beehive is really just providing them a sanctuary. So on warmer days, they're out and about. So you can see them. Right now, I don't have any going in, but you can put up your bee guards this time of year. Once you see a bunch of dead drones out and about, and once you see fewer drones, the few warm days that you get, look at them. See if the drones are still present. If there aren't any, then it's safe to put your mouse guard on. So look at the landing board, look at the activity, and we get those warm-ups, those last few days when it does rise enough so that the bees can still fly out and do their thing. If you're not seeing drones anymore, put them right on. And I'm going to show, we've gone over this before, but this is a robbing guard screen, but it also doubles as a mouse guard, and it's made by Bee Smart Designs, and it has this little pin that sticks down on the bottom so that when you put this on your landing board, there's a space here that's big enough for the bees to come and go, of course, but the mice can't get through it. Now, would a drone be stuck behind there? I don't know. So you could actually open the tops, which are part of this robbing guard function. If you open the tops, it would be extreme effort for the bees, but they could pull dead drones out. Or you can do maintenance on your colonies. And if you feel that you've put them on too soon and you might see some dead bees piling up behind it, I use kebab sticks. They're made out of bamboo. And I rake them under there and I sweep it out for them to make sure there aren't dead bodies. So you can actually rake them out if you feel you've put it on too soon. Some people put on hardware cloth, and they use 1/2-inch hardware cloth. And they put that over the entrance, and I think the bees can pull drones out through that pretty easily. So some people drop that down to 3/8 hardware cloth, thinking that a young mouse, a juvenile mouse, can actually get through. A shrew can get through the 1/2-inch cloth. So that's tiny. I don't see a lot of shrews going into the beehives, though. Usually where I live, they're deer mice. And another thing I've done in the past is I put out mouse traps on the landing boards for the deer mice. And I was rethinking that this year because I realized that I was baiting the mouse traps. So I was putting on mouse traps with peanut butter on them. So how do I know I didn't just attract deer mice from the adjacent area who could smell that peanut butter from way off? Then they climb up, then they get on the landing board, and they get snapped and they're dead when they had no intention of going into the beehive. So I might have just been killing off a bunch of deer mice for no reason. I have lots of skunks around. I have possums. We have raccoons. So we have a lot of things that would be eating those mice. So I don't think it's necessary. Now, if I do put up the snap traps, and I have put out a bunch of them, I'm going to explain why in a minute, but it's not for the mice. But you can put out the snap traps on your landing board that they would follow to go into your beehive, and just don't bait them. Just set them up as little trigger plates. So if a deer mouse is coming to go into your beehive for sure, because there's no bait attracting it, that's when it's going to snap the trap, and then you know that you got an invader. And you don't have to worry about the bees setting it off, because they don't. But guess who else sets them off? If you get a skunk that comes up and puts its front paws on that landing board and is trying to get bees to come out, then he's going to hit those little snap traps, and it's going to annoy him. But I found out it doesn't annoy him very much, because they stay right there. They just flip the trap off and keep doing what they do. So if you don't want to put it on too early, observe the landing board, see how many drones are coming and going, and then go from there. Or put in a type of guard that keeps mice out but still allows the drones to come and go, like that Be Smart Designs method, the hardware cloth, and so on. But it'd be really cool if you could put cameras out and get the motion and find out what mice are coming and what the activity really is, because I've got a really sparse collection of mice this year. The next question is from Robert Howells. What is the best way to clean feeders, hive parts, and tools that are covered with wax and propolis? Hot water doesn't do the job by itself. Well, what I do is I do use hot water to clean a lot of stuff, and then I just leave the wax on it. And that's because the bees use the wax for a foothold, especially when it comes to feeders and things like that. Often you'll see a bunch of propolis underneath, especially here where they've connected it to the inner cover. And so depending on the feeder design and how clean you want it to be, you definitely want to be cleaning off tools that you're going to be using in all your hives, because we don't want to be transferring bacteria from one colony to the next. You see people, they get their hive tool out, go right into this beehive, and take it all apart, do all their inspections and everything, and then it has propolis on it, it has wax on it. That stuff does not wipe off easy. So there is a need for you to clean that up, but then you're going from hive to hive, so you're actually transferring material from one hive to the next. And you may want to wipe them down or clean them off. And what I do to get these tools clean is I use a heat gun. And that's true for the queen excluders. If you've got metal queen excluders, it's another reason to have metal instead of plastic, is that you can take the heat gun to that and you can heat it up, and then you take paper towels, or old t-shirts are the best, cotton fabric. And when these get really hot, you just wipe them off with your paper towel, and you'll find that the wax gets soaked up right into that cloth material, and then you have a nice clean hive tool again. I also like to use 2 hive tools at once. One is because, of course, you get it started, then you can pry it more, then you get it started, then pry it more. So you can work with 2 hive tools at once to leverage off of one another. The other thing is I use them to scrape each other clean. And then I scrape that right into a bucket, and I have a stainless steel bucket. And at the end of the season, I use that heat gun to dump out and clean that stainless steel bucket too. So the heat is twofold. One, it's going to cause all your propolis and wax to melt enough to be manageable so you can wipe it off. The other thing, it's going to disinfect with heat. Some people use torches. I don't recommend torches. The hot gun, if you've got a extension cord that you can use out there, but just bring all your parts and pieces in and get them hot enough. Plastic you might have a concern with, so you definitely want to heat it up just enough so that you can wipe them down. And the bee inspector, when he came through, I asked him what he cleans his tools with, and he uses denatured alcohol. So I don't know how well that's working, and he's obviously going from one apiary to another, so he really has to sanitize his stuff. So I think the alcohol, I don't know how good a job that does on getting the propolis off, but the heat gun, I can say, definitely works. I've had that heat gun for 10 years. And I'll put a link if I can find it, if it's still listed somewhere. I'll put a link to that. It's not just a hairdryer. This thing gets really hot. So you decide how hot you want to make something. But that's what I use. And of course, denatured alcohol is what the inspector uses. And for me, though, again, some of the wax and stuff that's built up on the feeders or the edges or the carousel feeders, the bees put wax on there, and that gives your bees better footing. So I think cleaning it out and hot water treatments and stuff, and then leaving some of the wax remnants is actually beneficial. Thank you for that question. Another individual wrote, Varroa numbers are higher in the fall. Why is that? Okay. Well, there's a lot of reasons why there might be Varroa destructor mites, which, if you don't know, feed on your bees. They concentrate themselves in the fall when there's lots of drones, for example. Their numbers are increased. But you know what my thinking is about why the numbers seem higher in the fall? If you're doing mite counts, if you're using the sugar roll or if you're using the alcohol wash, I personally prefer the sugar roll method. You get higher counts in the fall. Generally, remember too that the number of mites in the colony may actually be constant. They may be running short on hosts. So as the colony goes into fall, their numbers are reducing. So the queen is, laying fewer eggs. They're having smaller brood numbers, which results in smaller numbers of workers. And then, of course, the drones are in decline as well. And if you're going to take a sample off of your brood frames and you're going to do a mite count, if the brood numbers are reduced, then you've got more adult mites cruising around attaching themselves to the bees and fewer bees to attach themselves to. So my thinking is because the population of bees is reduced, but the population of mites may not be reduced, they are glomming onto more bees than they otherwise would because, as I said, there are fewer host bees for the mites. So it could appear that your mite counts are higher per bee, and that's true, but the mite numbers in your colony might actually be the same as the number of bees that have been reduced. So higher concentration, and also I suggest that you look for, when you see those drone combs now and the drones have hatched out and they're gone, when you're inspecting, make sure to look for little tiny white crystals in there, and that would be evidence that you had Varroa, and that's their waste material. So you want to kind of see what's going on there, and then you can pull those frames and spray them with a bleach water solution to make sure and kill all bacteria in your drone frames as they're empty. Try not to go into winter with a bunch of empty comb. So then the next question is from the same person that continues, why is oxalic acid illegal to use with honey supers on when they've had it in Europe for over 20 years? And another viewer said where they live that oxalic acid vaporization is approved for their honey supers for human consumption. Why isn't it in the United States? That's a puzzler. If you've been watching my videos for any amount of time, I did choose oxalic acid vaporization. If I need to treat a colony, that's what I'm going to use. And the thing is, oxalic acid is already present in your honey. It's already present in the colony. According to the science, it does not build up in comb. It does not build up in the wax. It kills mites. And because it is in so many natural plant sources, that's how it ends up in your honey, even for those who are completely treatment-free. So then my next question was, and I've been asking everyone, and I put out bids to labs to do testing for me to show if I left Honey Supers on, and I tested with oxalic acid before and tested the honey after treatment. How much would the difference be in oxalic acid content in the honey, untreated and post-treated, if it were left on? And then I'm told by others that the numbers are so low that it is almost not significantly different. So then we turn around and say, well, if oxalic acid is safe in all these other places, why is the United States not approving it? First of all, oxalic acid vaporization and oxalic acid as a treatment to kill Varroa destructor pests is new in the United States. People that have been using it for 10 years were using it without authorization, by the way. So now that it's authorized, how does it become authorized? Well, somebody has to do a study. Somebody has to prove that it works as a pesticide, in this case. So those who got oxalic acid approved as a pesticide for Varroa to be used and show that it was non-detrimental to the bees, but detrimental to the Varroa, and could then be approved and used in beehives. The next safety net that they drew up was, because it's a pesticide, you cannot have Honey Supers on that are designated for human consumption. Well, why? Well, because it's not approved. Well, how come it's not approved? Every time somebody says take your Honey Supers off, when it's a seminar or a lecture or something, I always say, how come we have to take our Honey Supers off? What's the big risk? And then you get blank stares, because the risk has not been determined. Why? Because there hasn't been a study. So guess what happened? It starts to get clearer. In order for someone, and there were a couple of bee suppliers that got together that funded the Varroa study so that they could use oxalic acid and get that approved. And then their thinking was they would also get their oxalic acid approved. And then people, once it's approved, would go to them to buy the oxalic acid to use in their vaporization or in their drizzle treatments or however they applied it. And then they would make money from that, and then they would go on and request approval. Now we have a different approval line. They have to prove that it's safe for human consumption. Who funds the study when you get something approved by the FDA, which is what you're talking about, because now it's going into a Honey Super. Honey's going to be consumed by people. You have to prove that it's safe for consumption. Who funds it? The people that are selling it are the ones that fund it. Guess what happened? They never got the funding. They never did the study. Why? Because as soon as they published that oxalic acid works to kill Varroa, guess what all the beekeepers did? Amazon, Home Depot. It's just bleach. It's just oxalic acid. And they started buying it from all these other sources, even though those were technically not approved sources. You had to go with properly labeled oxalic acid, and the companies that generated it originally and got the initial approval for treatment of the Varroa did not get that market. People were not buying the oxalic acid from them. Therefore, the floor fell out of it, and there is no one funding the research to prove to the FDA that pre-treatment and post-treatment oxalic acid levels would be acceptable for human consumption. So what is different? Why is it okay in Europe? Why are people using it elsewhere in the world, pre and post? Well, first of all, you have to control the oxalic acid that's being used. So you have to get it from an approved source. And I don't want to say off the top of my head who has the approved oxalics, but I want to say that it's Brushy Mountain, which I believe is closed now. And then there is, it's Better Bee or Dedant that has approved oxalic acid. It comes in aluminum foil packs. So those are technically the approved sources. You can find out what's approved, and don't just buy your stuff in the paint center for wood bleach. Try to support these areas, and maybe we could actually get some kind of national level, the American Beekeepers Association, to pool their resources together if it's important enough, and do fund the studies and get the approval through the Food and Drug Administration and show the evidence that the before treatment and the after treatment exposure to honey would be at non-detrimental levels for human consumption, and then voila, you don't have to take your honey supers off anymore. A lot of people don't use oxalic acid because you have to pull off the honey supers, or as I try to tell people to do, put a cookie sheet, just tilt the front end of your honey super up, put a cookie sheet in there, close it down on top, then treat. Then after the treatment cycle is over with, you can allow them access to their honey super again. And there you go. So, is oxalic acid safe with the honey supers that are supposed to be for human consumption? In the United States, no. Why? Because of what I just shared with you. In other parts of the world, yes. Why? Because they got approval. That was really interesting to find that out. And I would love it if a bunch of people got together and kicked off a campaign to get that study done to prove either it is acceptable or it's not for human consumption once and for all. Guess what? Not a single lab agreed to test for that. They didn't think it was worth developing a protocol for it. They didn't think it was an area of interest enough to set up people to test for oxalic acid in honey. So right now, you can't even just send off your honey and find out what the levels are pre and post on your own. You can't fund it yourself because the labs that do the testing that are approved don't have that protocol set up. And what else do we have? So the people that commented and wonder why we don't, that's why we don't. Number 5, sugar mite test kit. Dust and heat causes mite sizzling. Oh, I have not demonstrated a sugar roll test kit. I have one. I have not made a video about it. It takes time for me to do that. I had planned to do that this summer. And why do I like the sugar rolls over the alcohol wash? Well, for one, the alcohol wash is going to kill the bees. A lot of people say, so what? You kill the bees, 250 bees, 300 bees, who cares? It's nothing when you're saving the colony. That's what people will say. But a sugar roll, let's say your eyes aren't so good, and when you're going through the brood frame, you're getting your bees off your brood frame, you scooped up the queen, and you dumped her in your test cup. And now you're shaking her, and you're going to do a varroa mite count. And then you realize, oh man, my queen's in there. A lot of people would say, well, if you can't tell the difference between a queen and a nurse bee, then you shouldn't be keeping bees. Well, I'm just saying, if it was sugar, nothing would happen. And the queen goes right back in with everybody else, all sugar dusted. And they groom off the heat generated from the bees and the grooming that they do when they're sitting in that little cup of powdered sugar, and it's regular confectioner's powdered sugar. You put them back in the hive. You didn't kill them, and you're going to get a varroa count. But people will say, that varroa count wasn't very accurate because if you're going to kill them, the alcohol wash is definite. You can really get a good count there. Well, my logic is if you have a bunch of varroa in your sampling anyway, and the difference between getting, if you use the measuring cup and you scoop your bees and you get your count and you've got 4 varroa with your powdered sugar and you got 10 with the alcohol wash, then would you not treat the 4? You might still treat. So, do you really need to know exact numbers over a certain level? If your mite counts are really high and you have a line of bees that require treatment, would you not treat them if you had 5 or 6 instead of 10 or 11? You would still treat. So the risks are lower when you use personally, I just like the powdered sugar shaking method. You don't kill any bees. I understand that the trade-off is, you kill the few to save the many kind of logic, and that's fine. But for me, powdered sugar tells the story. You can also look for other indicators within your colony. But if you have a line of bees that require treatment and you're going to treat anyway, what are you doing? Alcohol washing and getting a specific count. By the way, when we did treatments this year, this was my first year we ever did them. It was the second treatment cycle. We did oxalic acid vaporization. The second cycle produced the most varroa, and the third cycle produced almost none. So, the first cycle, it was evident. Second cycle, definitely great. Third cycle was just kind of a verification cycle, 7 days apart, to make sure that it's when the brood is open. And the other thing is, people are testing for varroa. You want to do a sugar shake or an alcohol wash, do it when you receive packaged bees. You're going to get an eye-opener. The bees that are coming in as packaged bees, ask those people that sent you the package if they did any kind of varroa destructor treatment before shipping. I will bet you 9 times out of 10 they did not, because that would add to the cost of your package. So if you get packaged bees and your queen has been put in that little queen cage and they arrive, you've got bees that you can treat, or you could test to see if they're carrying varroa with them, and you might be astonished by the number of varroa that are coming up from wherever you're getting your bees from in the package, or even as a nuke. And a nuke is when you have brood frames, the queen's laying and all the workers are together in one box. That's the time to check. But when you've got packaged bees, you have no brood. So you have a great opportunity. I almost recommend that you treat that package when it comes in. If you're using oxalic acid vaporization, put those right in your hive. Don't put the queen in yet. Treat them right away. Then add your queen after that treatment cycle is done. That way you don't stress the queen. Easy enough to inspect the queen to see if she's got varroa on her. Not so easy to physically inspect all those bees to see if they've got them. But a lot of people are reporting that they're doing counts on packages coming in, and they're finding a lot of varroa on them. So check them out. That's why I don't use the alcohol wash. It doesn't change my beekeeping methods where I live. Oh yeah, people are asking for updates on this thing. I put up a video that showed a skunk feeding on my bees. That thing was coming back every single night and he was jumping up. And then we put a bunch of these ultrasonic scaring systems out in the bee yard. And I put them really close. Like, here's the beehive, here's the ultrasonic unit right here. So, did it work? Yes and no. Again, we have cameras out there. I'm going to show you some video. What happened was, raccoons don't like these and they stayed away. Possums kind of come in and then they kind of get scared and then they run away. And I have identified at least 3 different skunks that come in. Now there's a very specific setting on this just for skunks. That is setting number 2. Repel animals such as cats, raccoons, badgers, and skunks, etc. So I put it on that setting. Skunk came right in like it wasn't even on. Then I turned it up to number 4, which is an audible alarm that I can hear. And it's supposed to be flashing lights to scare wild animals, generic. And the raccoons don't like it. Possums didn't like it. Rabbits don't care, and 2 out of 3 of my resident skunks don't like it, but I have 1 little skunk jerk that comes in and still, with these out, is trying to eat bees. So, if you looked in the opening sequence today, you might have noticed that in front of 2 colonies, there are little snap traps on the ground right in front of it, because when that skunk comes and he jumps up and he tries to touch that, he does little backflips and everything trying to avoid those traps. And then when they snap, they don't do any real damage to him, but he dislikes those snap traps enough that he has learned to stay off of the landing board. And as I mentioned earlier on, if you put little snap traps up on the landing board, these are mouse traps by Victor. You put those up there and he jumps up to touch that and he'll trip the traps and he flips them off and still hunts around for bugs. So there's no sign of injury, but there is definitely a sign that it annoys them. And that's just one of the skunks. The other 2 skunks don't even touch the landing boards. They don't jump up at anything. So they are not all the same. And I hope you can see some of that in the videos that I hope to add to this to show you what the skunk does. They get snapped and run away. Possum stuck his nose on one and it ran away, but it came back a couple hours later and just nosing around the ground. I don't mind if the skunks, possums, and so on come in and feed on dead bugs on the ground. It's the ones that antagonize the hives through the night to get the bees to fly out that like to eat them that way, fresh bees. That's the skunk I have to deal with and I have to do something about. So this works on raccoons and possums, doesn't work on rabbits, works on all but one skunk. So they're still okay, not perfect, and the only way I know that is because we do videos. So I still have a skunk problem. But the snap traps, just putting them out there like little booby traps, keeps them off of that landing board. So we'll see how that goes through the year, and I'll give you updates on that. Skunk trap. Now this one comes from Bongo Tukenchu. Does oxalic acid somehow get transferred to the honey? Oh, I already answered that. It does get transferred to the honey because it's already in honey. Honey anywhere has oxalic in it. Why? Because oxalic acid is in all these plants. So there you go. Terry Kleinweber. If my hive swarms, my queen has a clipped wing and can't leave with the swarm. How do they get a new queen, and what happens to the old queen? That's a good question, and you know what I did this year? One of my weaver queens that I bought was clipped and marked, and I put her in a colony. And the logic is, of course, that when it comes time to swarm, just because your queen has clipped wings does not mean that she won't be driven out by the workers, because it is the workers that decide that the queen is no longer useful and they want to replace her, so they start to make swarm cells. If the queen is deficient and she's unhealthy in some way and she's laying badly, they start to make a supersedure cell. Supersedure queen cell. Anyway, either way, they're going to drive the queen out. The difference with a clipped wing queen is when you go out there and see a swarm, it may actually be on the ground 10 feet in front of the hive. It also may be 2 feet high on a bush right next to your hive, and that is your clipped queen that was not able to make a full flight. So she is in jeopardy. She can't fly the way she should. She's not going to be able to go to a whole new site. So the thinking is that if you are around your apiary enough that you're going to know what's going on and you're going to see when they swarm, you're going to see that clump of bees on the ground or close by, then you know that that's your clipped wing queen, and you can rehive those, and you've collected that swarm, and now you basically have a split because the colony that is remnant in the hive that they came out of is going to generate its own queens, and you're going to have a whole new colony there. So she leaves all right. Now what happens if something happens to her? Let's say she's on the ground and you don't notice, and at night my friend, that skunk that ignores everything, comes in and eats that queen on the ground. What happens to all those workers? They go back to the hive they came out of. They stop their search for a new home. The queen pheromone's gone. You remove the queen. If you found her on the ground, you found that cluster, you pull that queen out and they can't find her anymore, they go back to the original hive. I've done those queen removals from swarms several times, and every single time the result is the same. The bees can't find the queen. They go back to wherever they came from. So did they get a new queen? Yes, they reproduce a new queen. And what happens to the old queen? Normally, you're going to have to house her. If you don't, I think she's just going to die because she can't fly adequately to go and find a new location that the scouts are going to designate for them. So she's basically bait. So what does that mean? What am I going to do? So from here on out, I do like the marked queens, although sometimes they actually clean her thorax off and the marking no longer exists. You think it's been requeened, but it's really just the original queen whose paint has been cleaned off by hygienic bees. So I will no longer put clipped queens in my colonies because the colony that had the clipped queen was one of the first to swarm. And she's gone, got replaced. I did not collect her, so she's basically just doomed. So that's it. Those are all my questions for this frequently asked question video. If you have a question or something came to mind while you were listening to this, write it down in the video description. There's another thing. Some people have been sending me pictures of their beehives that they've made, finished. One individual had everything I ever recommended on a beehive. So they've got the Flow Hive 2, they put a hive visor on it, they put a feeder shim on it, they use pyrography to decorate it. Pyrography is fancy wood burning. And then they put this extraordinary finish on it and sent me this photo. Plus, it was built on this fancy pedestal. And the way it was sent, we couldn't post it. If you have pictures of your beehives and you're proud of your handiwork and you found some unique way to set your beehives up and you want everybody else to see it, go to my Facebook page, Fred's Fine Fowl, and post your picture. I changed the protocol on the page so that viewers can post pictures and they can post links for everybody to see. And I would really love for everyone to see some of these beehives because they're incredible. If you've got a fancy beehive that you're really proud of, or you've done something unique in your winter preps, please share those there because I think that would be a cool place. People that are wanting to know how to communicate with me or how to get in touch with everyone else away from just a YouTube video, please go to that Facebook page and post away. If someone turns out to be a spammer, then I'll just block that individual. But if you want to promote something that you're doing with bees or you want to get an opinion of other people, please go there. I hope that you have a fantastic weekend, and I hope that today you enjoyed this frequently asked questions. And my catchphrase from now on is going to be the way to be. Thanks for watching. Have a good weekend.